I stood at the security checkpoint, shoes already in the gray bin. Boarding pass curled slightly in my hand. Portland wasn't far, just 2 flights and a long layover. My sister had promised warm cider, cranberry scones, and silence. It sounded perfect. I had left early, feeling organized. The file folder with Arthur's will was supposed to be in my tote, tucked behind the paperback I always carried, but never read. I reached inside more out of habit than purpose, and my fingers brushed against something unexpected. A folded piece of paper, not the crisp legal pages I had reviewed last night, but thinner, warmer from having been handled. I unfolded it. It was a printed screenshot of a message. My heart began to drum. From Arthur Everdeen time. 6:12 a.m. Message. If they ask about guardianship, don't sign anything. The real will is still in the drawer. I blinked. Arthur had been dead for 20 months. I had closed his account. I had held the phone in my hands at the funeral home. I had given it to the donation center myself. The number was disconnected. The message was impossible. And yet, the phrase real will made my stomach tighten. That was what Arthur always called the signed version, the one with his marginalia, his notes, the one he insisted I never let out of the house. My hand darted to the folder. I unzipped the tote and slid the copy out. Not the real one. The pages were thinner, the ink slightly blurred. I stared for a full 10 seconds. I turned and left without a word. My flight would board without me. By the time I reached the house, the sky had shifted to a pale steel. I parked in the driveway and walked to the door, my key steady in the lock. The air inside was too still. I didn't call out. My steps were soft against the wood floor. I moved past the entryway toward the hallway arch. That's when I heard Logan's voice, low, deliberate. If she slips again, we push for guardianship. No need to wait until after the holidays. I stopped breathing. I pressed my back against the wall and held my breath. The sound of their voices drifted from the study, quiet, careful, the kind of tone people use when they're sure no one else is home. She left the stove on last week. Logan said, his voice too smooth. We can start cataloging these lapses. I already spoke with Ashby Sloan, Dana replied. He said with a pattern of concern, it can move quickly, especially if we position it as protective, not punitive. Protective. The word landed hard, slicing through whatever disbelief I was still holding on to. Dana always had a gift for dressing cruelty in kindness. From the beginning, she had used a gentle tone to say the sharpest things. I remember the way she used to gently correct Logan in front of me, then glance in my direction as if I were the one making the mistake. They didn't know I was standing just a few feet away, hearing them speak of me like I was a case file in a drawer, one they planned to reorganize, remove, and replace. I backed away slowly, careful not to let the floor creak. My hand closed around the doorknob. I slipped outside and closed the door behind me without a sound. In the car, I gripped the steering wheel and stared ahead. The air had turned colder. The last few leaves clung stubbornly to the maple by the porch. I had worked 3 part-time jobs when Logan was small lecturer by day library, technician at night weekend translator when I could find it. I had given up a funded fellowship in Vermont to stay close when he got pneumonia at 10. I taught him how to research, how to cite sources, how to ask better questions. Now he was building a file on me. The ache in my chest wasn't confusion. It was recognition. Somewhere deep inside, I had known. I just hadn't wanted to name it. I turned the ignition and drove. But I didn't go far. Only one place came to mind, and it was the only place I trusted to hold what he couldn't twist. The university library hadn't changed much, at least not in the ways that mattered. The carpets had been replaced, and the front desk staffed with students I didn't recognize, but the air still smelled like ink paper and old wood, a scent I had trusted for most of my life. I signed in with my alumni badge and walked past the main stacks through the familiar maze of narrow corridors until I reached the door to special collections. My keycard no longer worked, but the young assistant at the desk, her name tag read, Alina, let me in without hesitation. She remembered my name. That comforted me more than I expected. The archives room was exactly as I'd left it years ago. Tall cabinets, labeled in thick marker beige lights, humming gently above. I knew where Arthur's records would be. I had cataloged them myself. Drawer C17, folder labeled Everdeen Arthur Originals. I slid it free with careful hands. The folder was heavier than I remembered. Inside were several documents, letters, insurance, paperwork, the original version of his will. Not the copy I kept in my drawer at home, the real one. I opened it and scanned each line. The legal language was familiar, but it wasn't what caught me. It was his handwriting. In the margins, Arthur had scribbled short notes in blue ink, just as he always did when reading contracts. His lines were tight, deliberate. Corliss retained sole executive power. No full access for son. Legal hold until independent review. He had underlined that last line twice. My eyes burned, not with grief though it flickered, but with something deeper. He had known. Not exactly, but enough to leave this. Arthur didn't trust Logan with power. He trusted me. I closed the folder and held it to my chest for a moment. The air felt clearer. I wasn't spiraling. I was anchoring, but I knew I couldn't do this alone. I needed someone who knew the system, who didn't ask questions, and who once told me, nothing you preserve is ever truly gone. I reached for my phone and dialed her number. I hadn't spoken to Morella Voss since Arthur's funeral, not because of distance or bitterness. We simply drifted the way people do when grief quietly divides what used to be shared. Still, when she picked up the phone and heard my voice, I didn't have to explain much. I just said, it's personal and legal. There was a pause. Then she said I'll be there by 4. She arrived wearing a navy wool coat, hair pulled back in the same sharp knot I remembered from our years together at the university. Morella didn't hug. She never had. She simply stepped inside, set her bag down, and took in the room like it was a file she'd been assigned to read. I led her to the kitchen table and slid over the folder. First Arthur's original will with the blue ink notes in the margins, then the printed message from his old number. Finally, the slim voice recorder, which I had already cued to Logan's quiet conversation about filing for guardianship. Morella listened without interrupting. Her expression didn't change, not even when Dana's voice joined his. She waited until the recording clicked off. Then she looked at me and said evenly, "You're not crazy. You're under attack." I didn't know how badly I needed someone else to say it until that moment. We got to work. Morella opened her laptop, her fingers moving like muscle memory. She asked questions quickly. When had Logan taken over my property taxes? Who had access to my accounts? Whether any prior documents named him executor? I answered steadily. She drafted a new revocation of power of attorney. We reviewed Arthur's original will, line by line, and scanned the annotations. She noted every line where Logan's authority was explicitly denied. We planned a quiet, complete transition, new will, new POA, legal timestamp, every file encrypted and backed up twice. She handed me a copy of the revocation document before she left and said, "This is your firewall, but we'll need more than paper." I nodded already, knowing where the next move would need to begin. The hardest part wasn't faking forgetfulness. It was letting him think I was too tired to notice. That morning, I left the refrigerator slightly ajar, set a measuring cup in the sink instead of the cabinet, took a phone call, then repeated the story to myself aloud when I thought no one was listening. I wore 2 different socks under my slippers and let the crossword puzzle sit on the table, half-filled answers just slightly off, enough to suggest confusion, but not chaos. The recorder was tucked behind the row of old poetry books on the living room shelf where I used to hide treats for Logan when he was small. It still blinked once when I clicked it on, then went silent. By 10:45, I heard the car. Logan didn't knock. He let himself in with the same casual entitlement he always carried. "Hey, Mom," he called too cheerfully. "Brought lunch." I looked up from the crossword, slowly squinting a little, as if just noticing the time. He walked in carrying a brown paper bag and a folder tucked under his arm. "Brought soup bread, your favorite crackers," he said, unpacking each item with careful hands. Then, almost like an afterthought, he slid a glossy brochure onto the table. "Just a backup plan," he smiled. "Places with gardens, music, therapy, really nice spots." I nodded slowly. "What day is it again?" I asked, not looking at him. He lit up just a bit. "Wednesday," he said gently, placing the soup on the stove. "Do you want me to heat this up for you?" I let my hands fumble slightly with the spoon. "That'd be nice," I said softly. He moved through the kitchen like someone cataloging more than soup cans. His eyes lingered on the calendar, the mail I hadn't opened, the vitamin bottle I left uncapped. He was taking inventory. After lunch, he offered to organize some papers. I nodded vaguely, as if unsure what he meant. The recorder caught everything, his tone, his phrasing, even the silence between sentences. When he left, I waited a full 5 minutes before I moved. Then I turned off the recorder and reached for my coat. It was time to set the second microphone. The air was colder that morning, the kind of stillness that made sound travel farther. I moved slowly across the porch with the cardigan tight around my shoulders, the second recorder already tucked beneath the ledge. I tested the range twice. It would catch everything. At 10:40, Logan pulled into the driveway again. He climbed the steps with a paper folder in one hand, and that same easy smile he wore when he used to bring home mediocre report cards, hoping charm would smooth over disappointment. "Thought I'd drop by," he said, "just checking in." I nodded, not saying much. He handed me a new packet thicker than the last. "Some additional info on that care center," he said. "Their admissions director is really understanding." I let my hands shake slightly as I took it, not opening it right away. We sat on the porch swing, and I asked what time it was. He told me without hesitation, then leaned in like a realtor selling a home. "They've got walking paths, a music room, even private rooms with fireplaces. It's honestly beautiful." I flipped the first page of the packet, just enough to see the line he'd circled in pen. "Transfer of medical proxy, contingent on observed need." I glanced at him. "Should I be signing something soon?" I asked, keeping my voice light, even curious. He paused, then reached into the folder and pulled out a slim form. "It's just preliminary," he said. "Gives them something to begin the intake process." I nodded again, let the paper rest on my lap without touching it. He excused himself to take a call. I listened through the open window as his voice carried calm, careful practice. Ashby thinks we're close. Just need a few more signs. I'll handle the form today. Next week should work. The porch swing creaked gently beneath me. I didn't flinch. I didn't blink. When he came back, he brought tea and another smile. I thanked him, took a slow sip, and said it reminded me of something Arthur used to brew in winter. He said nothing, just nodded. That night, I backed up the entire recording and labeled it Porch Discussion Ashby Timeline. The file was clean. The next day, Morella returned. Morella arrived just before noon, a leather case under one arm and her tablet already open. She didn't bother with pleasantries. We sat at the kitchen table while the kettle warmed, and she laid out the documents like stones on a path, deliberate, unmoving. First, the formal revocation of power of attorney, notarized and time-stamped. Then the updated will restructured with full clarity, no confusion, no loopholes. Next came the letter from Dr. Elkins, my primary physician of over a decade. He had run the full cognitive assessment at my request. The letter was short and direct, cognitively intact, no signs of impairment, capable of independent legal and medical decision-making. Finally, an affidavit from Mrs. Penfield, the neighbor across the street who had witnessed me organizing my finances, writing annotated grocery lists, and updating the voter registry form last month, all without assistance. Morella scanned each copy into her encrypted system. Then we sealed the originals in a large white envelope. On the front, she wrote in dark blue ink to Ashby Sloan, legal counsel, hand delivery only. We drove together to the building, a modest second-floor suite above a dental clinic downtown. Morella didn't ask for a meeting. She handed the envelope to the receptionist with a calm nod and said, "This is to be placed directly in Mr. Sloan's hands." Then she turned and walked out without waiting for a reply. That evening, her name lit up my phone. I answered before the second ring. "Don't worry," she said. "He's out." I waited. He called an hour ago. No pushback, no debate, just said, "He's stepping away." I didn't speak. And then he said, "Arthur once did him a favor," she added. Something about a quiet reference when no one else would vouch for him. It wasn't a confession, but it was enough. I sat by the window long after we ended the call, watching the branches stir against the sky. Ashby was gone. One wall had fallen, but another would rise soon. And I knew whose footsteps would come next. I heard the gravel before I saw him. No message, no call, just the slow, deliberate crunch of tires pulling into the driveway. The cider was already simmering. I had warmed it for the scent more than the drink-letting cinnamon and cloves drift through the kitchen like a quiet shield. It made the house feel rooted, intentional, mine. When the knock came, I didn't rush. I opened the door and found Logan holding a paper bag in one hand and a bouquet of yellow tulips in the other. He smiled too soft, too practiced, and stepped inside when I didn't object. "I thought these might brighten the place," he said, gesturing to the flowers. I thanked him and placed them in the green vase by the window, the one Arthur always used for Sunday clippings. Then I asked if he wanted tea. "Sure," he said, watching me closely. "Smells like winter in here." I poured slowly, let the silence sit between us like an uninvited guest. Logan pulled out a slim folder and rested it gently on the table, his fingertips brushing the edge like it was nothing more than a formality. "Just some follow-up paperwork," he said lightly. "I figured we could talk through it." I nodded and sat down across from him. Then I reached into the drawer beside me and slid out a small stack of papers, one by one, with deliberate care. First, the notarized revocation of power of attorney. Next, the updated will, legally binding and signed. Then Dr. Elkin's letter confirming my cognitive clarity in plain clinical language. And finally, a transcript of the porch recording his voice, Ashby's name, every careful sentence, captured word for word. Logan didn't reach for them. His hand stayed on the table, clenched, but still. I looked him in the eye, my voice steady. "Not all silence is weakness," I said. He stared at me for a long moment. Then he stood without a word, gathered nothing, and walked to the door. The quiet he left behind wasn't victory. It was a pause, and I knew what to do with the space it left. The envelope arrived 3 days later, hand-delivered by courier. Heavy paper, firm letterhead, Ashby's firm, though not from the man himself. Inside was a detailed record of every legal filing Logan had initiated on my behalf over the past 6 months. Copies of proposed declarations, draft affidavits meant to be signed by neighbors, phrases lifted word for word from our kitchen conversations. The guardianship case file had been real and closer to completion than I had imagined. He had been preparing to erase me methodically, and if I hadn't acted when I did, it might have worked. I sat with the documents, letting their weight settle across the table. Then I got up and began what I had always done best, organizing, archiving, preserving. The flash drive went into the fireproof safe. A second copy, encrypted and time-stamped, was uploaded to cloud storage using Morella's secure system. I labeled each file meticulously: audio, living room, WO1, legal, POA, revoked, transcript, porch discussion, and on. That afternoon, Morella's niece Tessa arrived. She was quiet with an archivist's rhythm, slow movements, efficient choices. She had the same still intelligence her aunt carried, but with a warmth that settled the air. "I heard you might need help digitizing a few things," she said simply. I handed her a small box of notebooks, my journals from the last 15 years. "They're messy," I warned. She smiled. "That's what makes them worth saving." While she scanned the first batch, I prepared a clean copy of the legal packet and placed it in a separate folder, one meant for her safekeeping. We labeled it Whitaker Primary Protection and added a log sheet to track any future additions. For the first time in months, the house felt full, not crowded, just connected, like a structure rediscovered after a long absence. That evening, I opened my current journal and wrote a single line across the top of the page: "I am no longer playing defense." The pen moved smoothly. The words felt final. And somewhere just beyond the porch, I heard Tessa humming an old folk song I hadn't thought of in years. The wind pressed softly against the window, a steady rhythm, like breath against glass. I sat at my desk, hands resting still, over the open journal, the pen balanced between my fingers. The house was no longer quiet in the old sense, not hollow, not watchful. It had found a rhythm again. Tessa's soft typing came from the other room, broken only by the gentle hum of the scanner. Somewhere near the kitchen, the kettle began to murmur, and the faint scent of chamomile drifted under the door. Every sound was small, but none of them asked to be excused. They belonged. I rose and walked room to room, pausing at corners I hadn't looked at in years. The frames were straight again. The side table had a fresh stack of labeled envelopes. The pantry door, once sticking, had been realigned by Tessa 2 mornings ago. Each quiet adjustment stitched something back into place, not out of nostalgia, but out of intent. In the hallway, the old rug had a fold from where her backpack had landed earlier. I left it, Back in the study, I opened the final page of my journal and wrote, "Let him speak first, then watch him fall." I closed the cover slowly, the sound of the spine clicking into rest. I slid it gently into the drawer beside Arthur's original letter, the one folded with soft creases, and his sharp, clear handwriting. The lines still caught me every time I saw it. If our son ever makes you doubt yourself, trust your instinct. You've always seen clearer than you believe. I tucked the key into the drawer's lock and left it turned, not to hide anything, but to mark it closed. The silence in the room held no absence. It stood with me, now steady and earned. Across the house, the printer clicked once, and Tessa called out, asking if I wanted labels in blue or black. I smiled and answered without hesitation. The page was mine again, and this time I would write every word,